In the early decades of the 18th century, Boston stood as the undisputed jewel of the British Atlantic, a bustling maritime hub forged by a unique blend of Puritan piety and mercantile ambition. This compact peninsula, jutting into the cold waters of Massachusetts Bay, was more than just a port. It was a crucial nexus of power, where the old world's traditions collided with the raw energy of the American frontier. It was a city of wood and brick, defined by the rhythmic tides of commerce and the rigid structures of colonial governance. By the mid-1700s, Boston found itself on the precarious edge of a profound transformation, caught in a tightening tension between its deep-rooted loyalty to the crown and a growing, restless desire for autonomy. Only a single generation would separate this peak of colonial prosperity from a violent upheaval that would leave the city scarred by conflict and eventually reborn into an entirely different world order. The decisions made in these narrow, winding alleys would not only reshape the city's skyline, but would ultimately ignite a flame that would consume the continent. In this exploration, we utilize modern visual tools alongside original maps, sketches, and 18th century engravings to reconstruct Boston exactly as it once stood, moving through spaces in ways that the original artists and cartographers could never have imagined. Our objective is not merely to observe the past from a distance, but to step inside it, to navigate the docks, the bustling markets, and the quiet residential squares as they existed 3 centuries ago. We will move through the shadows of buildings that have long since vanished and stand in the light of steeples that still watch over the city today. And if you stay with us until the end, we will return to these very same locations in the present day to see what time has erased, what it has buried, and what still remarkably remains as a witness to this formative century. The story of 1700s Boston begins with the geography of the Shawmut Peninsula itself, a jagged piece of land connected to the mainland by only a narrow strip of earth known as the Neck. In the early 1700s, this was a world dominated by the sea. To understand the city, one must first understand its relationship with the water. The harbor was the city's front door, and the Long Wharf, completed around 1715, was its grand hallway, stretching nearly half a mile into the deep water. It was a massive wooden structure lined with warehouses and shops, allowing the largest ships in the British fleet to dock and unload their riches directly into the heart of the town. As we move along the waterfront, the air is thick with the smell of salt, pine tar, and exotic spices from the West Indies. You can hear the constant clatter of horse hooves on timber, and the shouts of sailors in a dozen different dialects. Moving inland from the docks, the city reveals its Puritan heritage. The streets are not the grand, planned boulevards of London or Paris. They are organic, following the original cowpaths and shoreline of the 1600s. The North End is the city's most densely populated quarter, a maze of timber-framed houses with overhanging jetties that nearly meet above the narrow lanes. Here, the elite merchants live side by side with the tradesmen who fuel their wealth. The Old North Church, built in 1723, begins to dominate the skyline. Its soaring steeple a beacon for ships and a symbol of the Anglican presence that was slowly beginning to challenge the old Congregationalist order. In these early years of the century, the city feels permanent, wealthy, and remarkably stable under the British flag. By the 1740s and 50s, Boston was reaching its colonial zenith. The population had swelled to over 15,000, making it one of the largest cities in British North America. Faneuil Hall, gifted to the city in 1742 by the wealthy merchant Peter Faneuil, Noinabais, became the new center of civic life. Imagine the ground floor filled with the chaos of a public market, butchers, produce sellers, and fishmongers competing for attention, while in the hall above, the town's freeholders gathered to debate the local laws. This building was the heartbeat of the city's commerce and its politics, a place where the interests of the crown and the interests of the local populace were still, for the most part, aligned. The wealth of the city was reflected in the new Georgian architecture appearing in the South End and near Beacon Hill. Stately brick mansions with symmetrical windows and grand entryways began to replace the older, haphazard wooden structures. The seeds of friction were being sown. The city was a pressure cooker of competing interests. On one hand, you had the royal governor and his circle, representing the absolute authority of King George. On the other, a growing class of educated professionals and rugged laborers who viewed themselves as Englishmen with specific, unalienable rights. The taverns of Boston became the laboratories of this new thinking. The Green Dragon Tavern, tucked away in the North End, earned its reputation as the headquarters of the Revolution. Within its dimly lit, smoke-filled rooms, groups like the Sons of Liberty began to meet. These weren't just gatherings of disgruntled men. They were organized political machines. They discussed the latest pamphlets from Europe, the rising taxes on molasses and paper, and the increasingly heavy hand of the British military. As the 1,760 seconds progressed, the atmosphere in Boston shifted from one of prosperity to one of occupation. The arrival of the 14th and 29th regiments of the British Army in 1768 turned the town into a garrison. Red-coated soldiers were now a constant sight on the common, where they set up their tents and conducted drills within sight of the townspeople. This was a direct provocation. Imagine walking past the old State House, the seat of the British government in Massachusetts, and seeing the royal coat of arms gleaming in the sun, only to turn the corner and find a line of bayonets blocking your path. The tension was no longer theoretical. It was physical. Every interaction between a soldier and a citizen carried the risk of violence. That violence finally erupted on the night of March 5% of 1770. The scene centered on King Street, right outside the customs house. It was a cold, snowy night. A lone British sentry was being harassed by a group of young men and dockworkers. What began as insults and snowballs quickly escalated into a chaotic confrontation as more soldiers and more citizens arrived. In the confusion, shots rang out. When the smoke cleared, 5 men lay dead or dying on the cobblestones. This event, which we now know as the Boston Massacre, was a point of no return. The visual reconstruction of this moment shows the cramped, claustrophobic nature of the city streets, how quickly a small spark could turn into an inferno in such a tight-knit community. Despite a brief period of relative calm following the massacre, the underlying issues remained unresolved. The focus shifted to the harbor once again in December 1773. The issue was tea and the monopoly of the East India Company. The Boston Tea Party was not a riot. It was a disciplined, symbolic act of defiance. Imagine the quiet of the night at Griffin's Wharf as hundreds of men, some thinly disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded the 3 ships. Over the course of 3 hours, they smashed 342 chests of tea and dumped them into the salt water. There was no looting, no other property damage. It was a surgical strike against British policy, performed in total silence, witnessed by thousands of citizens watching from the docks. The British response was swift and devastating. The intolerable acts closed the port of Boston, effectively strangling the city's economy. The Long Wharf, once the site of so much wealth, now sat eerily quiet. Grass began to grow in the streets. Thousands of people fled the city for the countryside. While those who remained faced starvation and martial law, the city was now a fortress. General Thomas Gage, the military governor, fortified the neck, cutting Boston off from the rest of the world. In the spring of 1775, the tension reached its breaking point. From the steeple of the Old North Church, 2 lanterns were hung, a signal that the British troops were moving by water toward Lexington and Concord. The American Revolution had begun, and Boston was its ground zero. The climax of the city's struggle came with the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775. Though the battle took place on the heights of Charlestown, just across the water, the people of Boston watched it from their rooftops. Imagine the sight of the Charlestown Peninsula in flames, the roar of naval cannons from British ships in the harbor, and the waves of redcoats marching up the hill against the provincial redoubts. The cost of the British victory was staggering, and it proved that the colonial militia could stand against the finest army in the world. For nearly a year, Boston remained under siege, with George Washington's newly formed Continental Army surrounding the city. When the British finally evacuated on March 17, 1776, they left behind a city that was physically intact, but socially and politically transformed. The aftermath of the Revolution brought about a new order. Boston was no longer a colonial outpost. It was a leading city of a fledgling republic. The 1782nd and 92nd saw a massive wave of rebuilding and expansion. The hills of the city, which had once defined its defense, were now viewed as obstacles to growth. The top of Beacon Hill was sheared off to fill in the surrounding coves, a process of land reclamation that would eventually double the size of the city. The narrow, winding alleys of the 1700s began to give way to the wider, more orderly streets of the Federal period. The Great Fire of 1794 further accelerated this change, sweeping away hundreds of old wooden structures and replacing them with the sturdy brick buildings that still characterize much of the city today. As we look at the maps of 1700 and compare them to 1800, the transformation is staggering. The jagged, organic peninsula had become a more structured, confident urban center. But the soul of the city remained in its landmarks. The old State House, once the symbol of royal power, was now the site of the state legislature. Faneuil Hall was expanded by Charles Bulfinch to meet the needs of a growing population. The legacy of the 1700s was etched into the very stones of these buildings, a century defined by the struggle to define what it meant to be a community, a people, and eventually, a nation. Now, we bring our journey into the present day to see what has survived the march of time. If we stand today at the site of the Long Wharf, we find ourselves surrounded by modern skyscrapers and the concrete of the Big Dig. Yet the ghost of the 1715 structure still dictates the path of the water. The harbor has been pushed back hundreds of yards by centuries of landfill, but the historical marker of the massacre remains on State Street, directly in the shadow of the old State House. It is a jarring experience to stand on the modern, level ground of the financial district and realize that 300 years ago, you would have been standing on a steep hillside or submerged in the freezing waters of a tidal cove. In the North End, the past feels much closer. The Paul Revere House, built around 1680, still stands as the oldest residential building in the city, its dark timber siding a stark contrast to the Italian restaurants and modern apartments that surround it. The Old North Church still looks out over the harbor, though the skyline it once dominated is now crowded with steel and glass. To walk the Freedom Trail today is to walk a path through the 1700s, but it requires a constant mental effort to look past the modern world and see the city of wood, the smell of the sea, and the weight of the revolution that once occupied this space. Boston is a city that builds upon itself, layer by layer. The 1700s provided the foundation, not just in terms of architecture, but in terms of identity. The debates in Faneuil Hall and the meetings in the Green Dragon Tavern created a political culture that still defines the city today. It is a place that honors its history while constantly reinventing itself. The narrow lanes of the North End are a physical reminder that the past is never truly gone. It is simply the ground upon which the present is built. As we conclude our reconstruction, we are left with a sense of the immense scale of change that occurred in just 100 years. Boston began the century as a loyal, pious English town and ended it as a defiant, revolutionary American city. We have walked through streets that no longer exist and stood in buildings that changed the course of world history. The 1700s were a time of great upheaval, but they were also a time of great creation. We hope this journey through the 18th century has provided a new perspective on the streets you may walk every day. History is not just a collection of dates and names, it is a lived experience.